I have my phone, so I'll just pop open the YouTube channel on my phone and see if we appear in the void. Okay. And make sure I also changed the...
Usually takes about a minute.
Takes about a minute, okay. And then I'm going to go to the Dragon books.
RK Ashwick,
Yes.
what name do you want me to use when addressing you? Is it RK?
RK's fine, yeah. Thank you.
I'm
trying to keep the cat from stepping on the keyboard.
Yeah, that's the one there.
It's going really
You didn't
great.
change it to say...
Cozy Fantasy World Building, it says.
And
there we go.
We exist.
She's going to be a menace today. I can feel it.
She's so cute. A tail.
She's lucky she's cute.
And I'm going to...
got a couple too.
Oh, nice.
Background lurker.
Excellent.
Aw, I love that.
Around here.
Casey, I love the wall behind you. It's so cool.
Thank you.
Yeah, that's really.
It is a decal. That was the very limits of my husband's and I combined like artistic ability was to stick
I mean, even that
Unmute yourself.
decal though, that must have been really difficult to put up, right? Without like wrinkles or anything.
That wasn't too bad. It's just that all of those leaves are separate. Like they're all like individual things of 3 leaves, so there is like 200 pieces.
Oh, God. Well, it looks great. You did a great job.
Thank you.
Just a little green room chatter.
I was able to read all of y'all's books. Well, Stephen, maybe not all of your books. I did read Cursed Cocktails, and I loved them all. So this is really great. I'm honored.
Likewise.
Thanks. Actually, I downloaded yours and the Spell Shop, but I'm such a slow reader. I haven't gotten through them yet.
Yeah, same.
Yeah, I did only read Garlic and the Vampire of Yours, Bree, but there's more in that series, right?
Yeah, it's just one other book.
Okay.
Similar
I will need
themes.
to get that. I loved Garlic and the Vampire. Garlic was the cutest thing I've ever seen in my whole life. I mean, good God.
Yeah, my next book coming out is a little bit different. I'll get into that, obviously, in the panel, but
Cool.
but yay.
The live stream is populating. We have a couple of our first viewers who have popped in. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Cozy World Building panel. We have our host with us today, Casey, and then we have some amazing panelists who we will call on to introduce themselves in just a moment. I'd like to thank everyone for coming, and if you have anything, questions, please feel free to post them in the YouTube chat, and our moderator will be fielding any questions to the host so that maybe if it's relevant right then, maybe, but perhaps more closer to the end, we can address some of those questions as well. So thank you all. And awesome. We've got lots of viewers, and I will pass you on to our amazing host, Casey.
All right. Thank you so much. And welcome, everybody. I'm excited to get started. We're talking about cozy fantasy world building today. And this is structured as a workshop. So we're going to do a lot of talking about writing craft. There's definitely going to be a lot of stuff interested to readers who aren't writers, but if you are a writer, there's going to be a lot more kind of practical advice for you in this panel. So I want to just start off with introductions. Everyone introduce themselves, introduce your books, make sure to name your cozy fantasy books in particular, and then we will move on. So to start things off, I'm Casey Blair. My best-selling cozy fantasy series is Tea Princess Chronicles, beginning with A Coup of Tea. That is a finished trilogy, and the illustrated companion from Campfire just came out, which you can read even if you haven't read the main trilogy yet. So let's go to Sarah next, since you're next to me on my screen.
Hi, I'm Sarah Beth Durst. I write novels for adults, for teens, and for kids. This is my newest book. It's called A Spell Shop. It's cozy fantasy. It has lavender sprayed edges, which makes me very, very happy. It's very cozy, very cottagecore. It's about a rogue librarian and her best friend and library assistant, who is a sentient spider plant. And they open up a rather illegal spell shop. And the front for the spell shop is selling jam, specifically raspberry jam, because it's my favorite.
All right, Steve.
Hi, I am SL Rowland. I go by Steven, and I'm a lit RPG and a cozy fantasy author. The books I'm probably best known for here are Cursed Cocktails and Sword and Thistle. They're the first two books in my Tales of Adria series. They're all standalones. Right now, I'm working on the third book in that one.
All right, let's go to Bree. And all of you have your books ready.
I'm just like, oh yeah, they're right next to me. Hi, I'm Bree Paulsen. I am the author and artist of Garlic and the Vampire and Garlic and the Witch, which are cozy little fantasy graphic novels about an anxious bulb who has to confront a scary vampire. And then it's being called cozy, so I'll say it is. I have a book coming out at the end of the month called The Firelight Apprentice that follows two sisters in a world full of magicians and liches, and it's kind of in a post-war situation. So, yeah, that's what I do.
Great. And RK.
Yeah, hi, I'm RK Ashwick. I write cozy fantasy romance. The one you might be most familiar with is Arrival Most Vile, which is a queer rivals to lovers story set between two potion shops. And just this week, the sequel came out that is a captured cauldron. That's me.
All right, thank you. And let's get going. Also, just for audience reference, I am going to try and let us talk for a little while to kind of get that going and get all those juices flowing uninterrupted before we start taking questions. So I promise I'm not ignoring you. I just want to give us time to kind of gel as a panel first. So let me start out with a fun and lighter one, which is let's talk about food. So all of us are doing food in some capacity in our books. So I want to ask you how you actually use the food or meal times specifically to build the cozy vibes and the fantasy world building at the same time in your books. So I'm going to throw this one first to Stephen, if you don't mind. Let's talk about cocktails and how you're using those cocktails to kind of build the atmosphere, build the themes of your book.
Definitely. I use drinks a lot more than food in most of my stories. But I think that a lot of people, you share a drink with someone, and that's how you get to know someone, whether it be coffee or tea or, going out to the bar. It's a great way for people to interact with one another. And I think that's no different in a fantasy world. Like always, some of my favorite scenes in the more like epic fantasy novels are the tavern scenes where everyone, they're just taking a load off and they can finally relax, and like that's kind of when they get to process everything that has happened. So having a story that is just like mainly those type of scenes, I think it really helps with the character building, and also giving the drinks a bit of personality to themselves, because with my Tales of Adria series, I made this epic world with like 7 different kingdoms, and a lot of the different cocktails and alcohols come from the various locations across the realm. And so, each one has a little bit of personality, and you're able to kind of showcase the different regions by the drinks that they make.
Yeah, that's great. I'm actually going to jump off of this next because I am also doing drinks, because Tea Princess Chronicles is, as you might expect, about tea. And magic tea in particular. And one of the things that the protagonist Miara is doing is, as she's serving tea, she is tailoring the choice of each tea and how she actually twists it. And you maybe adds an extra ingredient or steeps it for longer based on what she sees an individual needs in that moment. And so it's that act of connecting with another person and serving them tea and believing that everybody needs tea, or deserves a cup of tea even if they can't pay, and that becomes a thing in the book. So, and with these teas, they're using magical ingredients from this magical disaster zone that is so central to the plot, that that's where the tea shop is kind of set. So it's at the same time doing both kind of those individual connections, which is a little bit what Stephen was talking about, as well as using that world building in order to make those individual connections and see those people and connect with people. And that connection with individual people as well as your community, I think, is just so core to what makes cozy fantasy work. And so from here, I actually want to go to Bree, because you're just like, everything is food. Everything.
Yeah, they're all vegetables. So, yeah, I guess my use of food in the story is that those are it's the characters. Yeah, because I did this little drawing of a little garlic person. I became obsessed with these old seed packet cards, where they would have like these anthropomorphic little characters on the packet itself, and I started drawing little anthropomorphic vegetable people, and I really liked this little garlic character that I made. Gave her a little steak and like rosary and things. I was like, oh, she has to go fight a vampire, and it just kind of spiraled from there. Yeah, and then like I know that some people are kind of put off by the fact that they also then sell their like representative produce at market, and then of course like there's the scene in the first book where she's kind of freaking out, like, oh God, are my vegetables alive? But yeah.
Yeah, and that's really great. We're kind of literalizing the metaphor a little bit there with like the food is like endemic to life, and the food is just kind of every part of their lives and our lives.
The food is comfort. Also, the food needs comfort.
Yes. Okay, let's take Sarah next.
I did a lot of research for writing this book. I had to go to the farmer's market every Friday and try out a new kind of jam. It was really rough. And I drank so much hot chocolate, like way too much hot chocolate, right? I can't write a food scene without snacking. So the amount of cheese I went through. So yeah, so all the food scenes I was also eating as I wrote them. For me, actually, they were a very key part in writing cozy fantasy, because cozy fantasy, it's so much about the vibe. It's about the feeling that you give the reader, that the reader is being hugged, that they're taking a deep breath, that they're drinking hot chocolate wrapped in a blanket with a cat on their lap and the snow is falling outside, or that they're sitting on the beach and drinking strawberry lemonade. And for me, by emphasizing the food and the taste and the experience, it tied directly into creating that feeling of joy that I think is so important, at least for me, in writing a cozy fantasy. That joy of being alive, of being in the moment, of existing in a body and experiencing those little delights of the taste of a fresh sun-ripened raspberry. And I used those food moments to connect the character with the world, with the moment, and to control the pace of the story as well, to keep it feeling like that deep breath, that even if there was some peril, it's going to be okay because that cheese is really good.
Yeah, I think you hit on a few good points there, and we're definitely going to talk more about vibe later, because that's just so key to cozy fantasy. But I also want to kind of reemphasize what you just said about the experience, that like so much about not just food, but about eating scenes or drinking scenes, as the case may be, in fantasy novels, is about focusing on the experience of the taste of being in your body, as you said, of the togetherness of being with other people, of what it means to have this food, of the joy you get. And that experience also helps you both create the cozy vibe and also, as you said, can help you with the pacing. It allows you to kind of bring things back and slow things down a little bit. We're not mostly just kind of like shoveling the food in. We're not just kind of guzzling a whole jar of jam. In general,
So that's acceptable as well.
no judgment. So there's a few great points to take away there, and let's go to RK.
Yeah, I think some of my notes are going to echo what Stephen and Sarah said specifically about, for me, for both Rival and Captured Cauldron, food is a great way to both slow down the scene and also just on a very human level signify that the characters are safe. And so I think particularly if you've got like higher stakes moments or you're coming off of a really emotional scene, food is kind of a way to reorient the reader and reassure them that it's still cozy, these characters are still okay. And then also kind of what Stephen was saying about different drinks representing different cultures and kind of like world building in that way. I think on a very character to character level, it says a lot about the character based on what kind of snack they like or like what their favorite food is or what's their favorite cookie. In Captured Cauldron, there is a magical bakery that opens up on Rosamond Street, and the baker takes the time to learn everyone's favorite cookie. And so I had to think about like, okay, well, what would Grimm like? What would Ambrose's favorite cookie be? What does that say about them? And so it's a very nice, seamless way to world build on a large level and a small level without info dumping.
Yes, that's great. And I think a couple of us have also hit on this point of that, like the actual choice of which food we're using is also really key for character building or for world building. What ingredients they have, why jam? Because jam gives you joy. Cocktails also because that's a connection to his father, right? And his recipes. And so then you have those individual connections. And so you're not, even if you choose a food at random, you're still linking it into all of these different parts of the book. And generally, you're not just choosing a food at random. And this also links really neatly to my next question, which is that all of us basically, and one really common aspect of cozy fantasy in general is that they tend to be about characters who have normal day jobs, which is kind of distinct from a lot of secondary world fantasy in particular. Like a lot of them are shopkeepers in particular. They're selling a product. They have normal jobs, and the books will in some ways feature them doing the day-to-day work that those involve. We've got Among Us, just to review since I know not everybody has read everybody's books yet. Among Us, we have a tea shop, a jam shop, a cocktail shop, a apothecary, and a farmer's market. So how do you choose what job your cozy fantasy protagonist is going to be doing that will be cozy? And what are some tips you have for making those daily jobs like not boring to read about? Since we are doing fantasy, we do have, our readers are looking for escapism from normal daily life and jobs, but we need this to be cozy. So is it the choice of the job itself? Is it the pacing? Do you skim over the boring parts? Is it the atmosphere, the banter? Talk to me about how you make this work. And I'm going to reverse the order here and start with RK because you've been last the last couple of times.
Okay, all good. Yeah, I took notes on this because I really like this question. How do I choose like what kind of job? I just think of stuff that I like, which is a lot of food and shiny things. And so that's kind of how potion shots came about, as I was like, potion bottles are really nice and shiny, and I like to look at them. And what would be nice is writing a whole book about these shiny bottles. And then other things that like I have in mind for the future. Obviously, I mean, just like Sarah is like, oh, food's great. This gives me an excuse to try out more food. So like bakeries, cafes, candy shops. It's just purely on a selfish level. It's like, what do I like? And then in terms of making sure that like you can keep them cozy and not boring, I think it's just a matter of balancing it in the story. I think a lot about cozy fantasy is just about balance. But yeah, focusing on the nitty gritty and details of running the shop when it's relevant, but then also supplying a lot of other things going on. So like, relationship growth and other plots so that you're not always just kind of sitting in the shop dealing with the shop, because I think that can get a little cramped for the reader. Particularly if you already have a light plot, I think you do need something to move it forward. So I think it's about balancing it there. And then also just making sure that the place is something that is both comforting and fascinating. And so I think something like a, magical cafe where like, yes, we as just normal humans already feel comfortable sitting at cafes, but how can we elevate it a little bit? How can we romanticize it and make it a little more escapist? And so, yeah, just all of that. It's
Yeah,
really
I
fun.
love what you said about starting with things that make you happy, because that is so much, as Sarah mentioned, about cozy fantasy being like a hug. This is how we get the joy in. We
Mhm.
start with the things that give us joy, and then we share them and make it just like a little bit more magical.
Yeah.
Let's go to Bree next. Like, why did you start with a garlic bulb?
I like vampires. um, I got my start in comics doing a webcomic called Patrick the Vampire, and so did a lot of research about vampires and stuff. Did like a series of enamel pins about like different items throughout history that have been used to ward off vampires. So of course, a little garlic being a protagonist against a vampire. I just got this. A lovely human sent this to me who was a scare actor at that scary farm. Made it for me. But yeah, I need a refresher on the question because I got just.
How do you choose what job your cozy fantasy protagonist is going to be doing, and how do you make sure it's cozy but not boring?
Yeah, so I kind of get into it in the second book where they are vegetables that have become sentient in a witch's garden. Because she's getting old, she needs a little bit of help. So now she has this little community of these little villagers to not just like help her out, but are also just like company. And she can now focus on like actual witchy duties, like being like running an apothecary for like the local village and stuff. And it just kind of they're having abundance of produce now, so might as well sell it and stuff at a market. Yeah, and like because it's a graphic novel, I can just get into more of the tactile like visuals, like the Ghibli moments where you're seeing dew on the leaves and like all the little like things that you can just hear and feel. Rather than just like explaining. What?
You can use the art a lot to build your atmosphere as
Yeah,
well.
so I can create like those really nice, calm, quiet moments, especially when things get a little bit more emotional for Garlic and she's starting to freak out.
I feel like
I'm
even
actually
your
going to
color
jump off
palette
of this
is just
next
really
because
nice.
I love what you said about the community. Because for me, one of the advantages of the tea shop, in more the cozy mystery tradition, my protagonist is arriving at a new town and making all new quirky sets of friends. But the tea shop and running the tea shop puts her in a position where she has to interact with the community. So not just the people that she's working with, but the people in the community and seeing their struggles and how things there are impacting them. So it gives her a really direct line to not just meeting people as individuals, but also like understanding the community she's in and being a part of that, which I think was really, because I think that community aspect is really important in cozy fantasy. I think that that is one of the benefits of having shops in general, is because you are literally serving the people of your community, like that's how you make money. It forces you to actually be part of that community in a way, even if, in our case, despite his best efforts in book one to not have to interact with humans. And for me also, tea, like one of the reasons I did a tea shop was because I used to work at a root beer store. And I had all of these really bizarre stories of like small business disasters that happened behind the scenes of the root beer store. And I wanted to kind of have a way to put like little anecdotes into a fantasy and kind of use that background. But all of the and being part of that store, there's also all of the relationships you make with people there, but also then having this kind of magic as part of it. You're still trying to take this food that brings you, or beverage that brings you joy. I'm kind of including beverages in the sustenance category here, to use that as a method that brings people joy. So there are bits that I mostly worked in either skate over pacing, if it's like, and then we spent hours doing inventory. Like, we don't actually spend 3 chapters doing inventory, right? You skate over that in a paragraph.
If only.
Right.
I was a barista. No.
Yeah, understood. But I could also use those things for character development, be like, okay, our manager has saddled me with this task that I didn't understand, and I'm going to use it to advance my character growth by making these other choices to get around the strictures and bringing it into the larger plot. And like in our actual daily lives, like we don't have to have, internal consistency and like a narrative arc, but stories do. And so you can use those, the bits of the daily life and actually give them meaning in a way that kind of elevates them and makes them more interesting as opposed to just drudgery. So let me go to Steve next. Steven, sorry.
So I think, like, for me, like the most important part of their job is that the character has to have a passion for what they're doing. And I feel like if it's a job that they are not enjoying or stressing them out, then that's kind of going to take away from the cozy vibes. Because if you have a job that you enjoy doing, like, yes, there are always those moments where it feels like work, but a lot more of the time, there are the moments where you just enjoy doing the job. And I think also the interactions with the customers, with the guests, whatever it is, that those are your interesting moments. Like, you don't want to focus on the downtime and the boring bits. You want to stick with what's interesting. And most of the time, it's the characters that are bringing the excitement to the story.
Yeah, that does also make me think of Arrival Most Vile also, because you have 2 apothecaries there, right? And one of them is passionate about what he does, and one of them discovers he is not passionate about what he does. And how you played those, that juxtaposition against each other, I think worked really well. But also the one who isn't as passionate ends up finding his passion in helping the other one, right? So he finds it in a different direction. And I loved how you managed that juxtaposition, and also how you kind of redirected it and kind of shifted it into what he is passionate about and what he does care about, rather than just dwelling on him being like, yeah, I'm going to spend a whole chapter counting bottles. We're not doing that.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Sarah,
Love those
what are your thoughts on this?
I have been in love with fantasy books for as long as I can remember, my entire life. I got asked in an interview not that long ago, how have your reading tastes changed now that you've grown up? And I was like, no one's told me they were supposed to change. You look around my room and it's all like, girl with talking wolf, girl with dragon, girl with sword, girl, And the thing I have always loved about fantasy books is when you close them and the world feels a little bit more magical than it was before, that there's more wonder in it, and that you feel stronger than you did before. And I think that cozy fantasy goes for that by saying not only is the magic there, but the magic is in the everyday. The protagonist in our stories, they're not the chosen one. They're not the prince, the princess, the brave warrior that saves the day. Mine's a librarian that really just doesn't really want to talk to people that much and would like to just have her books, and that's all fine. And I think that's one of the strengths of cozy fantasy, is to say that magic is everywhere and magic belongs to everyone. And I think that's one of the reasons why we'll choose like a tea shop or a jam shop or a farmer's market, is to be like, okay, yes, this is a magical version, but there's magic in you and around you as well, so that when the reader gets to the end, maybe some of that magic goes on and lives with them.
Yes, I love that. All right, I'm gonna skip a question here because I want to make sure we get to, before we talk about all the things we can do to build that cozy fantasy vibe, I want to talk about darker subjects in cozy fantasy, because I hear sometimes people will say like, oh, you can't have any darkness in cozy fantasy, and I just don't think that's true. I think it actually is one of the things that will make the lightness and the joy matter. But I want to talk to you about, because among this group we have people who are dealing with PTSD, with systemic racism, with revolutions that are still harming innocent people. How do you make sure that your book is still cozy while dealing with the heavier topics and themes? How do you use tone? And for Bree, also, how do you use your art style to help with this? So let me actually throw this one to Sarah first.
Yeah, I mean, I think you can have any dark topic that you want in your cozy fantasy story. I mean, the backstories of some of my characters have abuse and death and not dealing well with people and things going wrong. The first chapter starts with a revolution in the empire and the library starts to burn. We get away from that, like the books are fine, she saves the books, and so does Kaz. He's grabbing them with his tendrils and his leaves. It's going to be okay. And that's the key part. It's going to be okay. And I think that's how you are able to handle any darker themes that you want to put in there, is that the reader has to trust. You have to establish that trust from the very beginning, that this is a world that's filled with hope and everything's going to be okay. And you have to keep that promise when you write it, that everything's going to be okay. And that's how you achieve the hug. And you can achieve it through the food, like we talked about, like the stepping back and sharing a moment from that moment. So one thing that cozy fantasy can do that I think other genres can't, or at least can't as easily, is have that moment of stillness. You know that scene in Spirited Away, the Studio Ghibli movie, where she's just on the train and the train is going through the ocean and No Face is sitting there and there's just beautiful classical sounding soothing music and they're on that train for a while, and it's that moment of we're okay. I think that's what enables you to handle the darker stuff.
So how do you actually, you establish it from the beginning that things are going to be okay. But for most of us, we're having, our characters are going from journeys from being like not happy or fulfilled, etc., to where they get to. So how do you establish at the beginning that things are going to be okay when they are not currently okay?
The kindness, for me, that's how I do it. The kindness in characters that show to each other. I really made the conscious choice to portray healthy relationships, non-toxic relationships, the friendships, the romance that's in it, that people show kindness to each other.
And communication also. I loved that.
Yeah.
All right. Bree, let me toss this to you next.
It's funny because I'm a big fan of like From Software games, so like Elden Ring and Bloodborne are my cozy games. But yeah, ever since even like my webcomic, which is a vampire-centered story where like he's a goofy guy, but we get into some really cat jump scare. We get into really like heavy subject matter, and I think one of the things is that lends itself about cozy fantasy is that it is a safe place that that you're gonna get reassurance that like these feelings are valid and it's okay. Like that's definitely something I touch in Garlic. Like her anxiety is never talked down upon, like it's taken seriously. When she's scared, she is treated like, yes, you're scared. Here, let me give you some tools to make things better. And like in the second book, like she's facing something that is really scaring her. It's big change and she doesn't know what to do about it. And like having the reassurance to be like, it's okay to be scared. Like it's not going to be fun all the time, but there are going to be moments where it is going to be fun. And you are going to be around people that love you and you love. In my upcoming book, like this deals into like war trauma and parental death and having the quiet moments where like characters are able to grieve together, to have like these emotional quiet beats where like all their feelings are understood and validated. Like I think that's what is nice about cozy fantasy, because it does open up itself to have those quiet moments where you do get to sit and like decompress with the characters after like an emotional ordeal, which like sometimes you don't get in other fantasy genres where like it's just constant. You're not ever getting that like moment where characters can digest what just happened, and that's often over food or drink, just something. But yeah, like I feel like what makes cozy fantasy really like excel at is like when there is like a really good balance of the dark and the light, because it just makes the more hopeful moments much more hopeful in contrast to like people overcoming pain and trauma.
All right, I'm definitely going to get back to that validation point you just made in our next question. But first, since you've just mentioned trauma, I want to take this to Stephen next.
Okay.
We're coming.
One of my favorite quotes is what good is the warmth of summer without the cold of winter to give it its sweetness? And like I feel like that is very much applicable to cozy fantasy, because if all you have is sweetness throughout the whole thing, like then you're never really going on a journey. And I feel like those darker moments, I mean, they have to be well managed, and like they can't overtake the plot, but they are what help give balance to the story. Um, and like for my books, Cursed Cocktails deals with someone suffering from chronic pain, and Sword and Thistle is about an adventurer who has a lot of grief from someone he lost in the past. And their journeys in dealing with those elements are just as important as the plot itself, and it kind of intertwines with the flow of the story as they're kind of coming to terms with those things and able to find relief or to find healing along the journey.
Absolutely. All right, RK.
Yeah, I agree with what everyone has said so far about balance and contrast. I think that's really important. I love darker themes in cozy fantasy, which makes sense because Capture Cauldron, Ambrose gets kidnapped, and I swear it's still cozy. So I like that you can have more emotional punches. It just has to be balanced right, so you're not constantly dwelling on the darkness, and you're also not skating over it too much. So it's taken seriously enough for the narrative. It also, for me, it really helps to have characters dealing with these heavy thoughts while they're in safe spaces. And I think that goes back to the validation that we've been talking about, is whether that's a literal safe space or just a metaphorical safe space while they're with their friends or their found family. I think that really helps soften the blow, and helps with that reassurance of, hey, they're going through these things, but it's going to be okay. Because I think in real life, that's what we want too. We want a support network helping us through those darker moments. And I think for darker fantasy, you don't always get that. There's a little more despair and hopelessness. But for cozy fantasy, you need to have that support.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think what everyone has said about compassion is really important. That I think one of the things that cozy fantasy does so well is that we have characters who care about each other, and that matters in the narrative. Your found family, part of the whole point of cozy fantasy is you're finding your people and you're caring about them, and that caring actually matters in material plot thematic ways. And that's one of the reasons that's so important. We have the dark stuff, but we're not characters, even when they have darker moments in the stories in cozy fantasy, they're not kind of like wallowing or dwelling there. It is part of their journey moving towards healing, and healing is possible. And I think what Sarah said about establishing at the beginning, and that this is the kind of story that is going to be hopeful, and showing those characters who actually care about people and have compassion, is so key to how you get to a story that is about healing, and how that this is not just going to be like, we're going to spend half the book in dark nights of the soul. You know, we're not doing grim dark here. Not only are characters going to try to change their lives and their worlds, but it is possible narratively. The world is constructed in such a way that it is possible for their caring to matter and to change their lives and the lives of those around them. And I loved what Bree brought up about validation, and I want to take a moment to talk about something that is also really common in cozy fantasy in particular, which is that, and all of us are all writing about people who have marginalized identities of some kind, whether it's neurodivergence or disability, or there's racial issues, classism, queerness, and those are all really common in a lot of the most popular cozy fantasies. And I think that validation of finding the found family where your differences are celebrated and supported is really very key. So I want to ask, how do you approach the visibility of the representation and how much to center it when it comes to conveying to readers that spirit of validation? Because we sometimes have people struggling with the realities of those identities and others where it's a non-issue, and both are doing different things. So for me, I kind of think about it as kind of like a spectrum of escapism. There's the kind of escapism where, you know, women don't have to fight against the patriarchy because it's just a non-issue. Women are considered equal, and that's one kind of power fantasy. And there's another where they're overthrowing the patriarchy, right? And they're having to grapple with that, and that's a different kind of escapism. And I think we can do both, and you can't, you know, no book can focus on every single struggle of marginalized identities that exists in our world, and I don't believe that they should. You know, we don't have to recreate everything, every injustice in our world, because like we live in that. We don't need it in all of our fiction. But how do you balance making the cozy fantasy feel validating when you're dealing with those kinds of struggles and the, you know, the lived realities, while still being cozy? So I'm going to start this one with Stephen first, because you do this so well dealing with chronic pain in Cursed Cocktails.
So with regards to the chronic pain, like that was a very like personal experience for me, because I have an autoimmune disease. And so I based the chronic pain that he gets from using his blood magic on like things that I have experienced myself. And I think that grounded it in reality for a lot of people. And I've gotten a lot of messages from people who also have various like autoimmune diseases or anything like chronic pain that they deal with, that, you know, felt that appreciation for, you know, being able to see that represented. And while it was an important part of the story, like it wasn't the sole focus. So I touched on it here and there, and like I wanted to ground that character's past in it, but as the plot moved forward, like his focus was moving somewhere warmer and no longer using his blood magic so that he could find that relief. So it was about him healing and starting over. So I didn't have to touch on the negative aspects very often. And it was also very important for me to make sure that this was a queer normative world where, you know, people could just exist as they are, and there are no negative connotations to that. You know, it's a world where, you know, people can be themselves. There's enough struggles in the world outside of that I didn't want that to play a part.
All right, and let's take this to Sarah next.
For me, I think fiction at its core is telling the truth by using lies. No, we're not talking about factual places and like real people that actually exist doing real things. I mean, I have, you know, random unexplained unicorns wandering here and about, and mer babies, and a sentient spider plant and so forth. These are not fact, but what I'm trying to talk about is really truth. And for me, the most important thing is to write about real people, even if they're a plant. They need to feel real to me. I need to fall in love with them. Our job is pretty much to make up imaginary friends and like hang out with them all day. So to me, I want to reflect the real world. I want to reflect people and people's souls in all different shapes, sizes, and ways of seeing the world, and tell their story as honestly as I can from an emotional standpoint. I think that probably if I was going to boil it down to writing advice, it would be that. See your world through the eyes of the character as honestly as you can. No matter how many impossible things you add into that world, take it from a place of emotional honesty, and then it will resonate with you and hopefully with other people as well. And you can represent whomever you want to represent that way, as long as they feel true.
I think that's so important, that making sure your characters are just kind of fully rounded, that they feel like real people. And I'm going to actually go from that to Bree, because of course that's really interesting given that like most of your characters are vegetables.
I put that sentence. That was an amazing sentence. Sorry.
I mean, sapient, sentient vegetables, but nevertheless.
Yeah. Because my books are for kids, I definitely want, like, basically I wanted to help people be seen with not just like Garlic's anxiety and stuff, but like actually seeing a mentor, like Garlic has a couple mentors in her life who offer her advice, and like I very much know that not all kids are gonna get that kind of validation, and like me I deal with a lot of anxiety myself, like the advice and things that like the mentor characters in the books give her like is very much advice of me giving to myself. And then in this book, I don't necessarily touch on like mental health as much, but like these two are sisters and she has a lot on her shoulders, and she having those moments where like her struggles are being seen, and having moments where she does have a mentor like figure to kind of be like, hey, yeah, that's rough, buddy. Which a lot of kids kids go through a lot. They're people, like they go through as much as we like adults do. So it's just like their issues are not necessarily taken as seriously, even though some are literally carrying the weight of their own families on their back. And then just having other people kind of throwing in advice that isn't helpful whatsoever, especially when you already have so much going on. And it's like, oh, well, why don't you go and have a date and you'll feel a lot better. It's like, number one, I'm not interested. Number two, I have stuff to do. So hopefully through that, like kids who are in similar situations are able to kind of feel seen in the struggles that they have to deal with in carrying their own family when like they have a deceased parent and one that is not doing well at all. So yeah.
All right, RK.
Yeah, I'm going through my notes to make sure I'm not just repeating what everybody else said. I think when it comes to how much to center representation, I think that's going to be just a very individual author choice based on the kind of story you want to tell, your own personal experiences coming into it, like Stephen and Bree. And then also, one thing I found when talking to other writers is your personal experiences that subconsciously go into it, particularly for people who either are neurodivergent but maybe didn't know it at the time, people who are trying to figure out a disability but don't quite know what it is, or people who maybe are like pre-transition or are questioning themselves, but it's just kind of subconsciously seeping in. And when they go back and look at what they wrote, they were like, oh, that's why that's in there. Or like some person will come in and be like, oh, I really love the representation of this. And you're like, oh, I didn't even realize that I had written that in, but that's very much because it's a part of the individual author identity it's just seeping through. So I think that's a very cool part of cozy fantasy is I think people are very much either consciously or subconsciously exploring a lot of that. So in terms of centering, I think it's just going to be very individual. And then in terms of how, my recommendation, and of course this is all like based on accessibility and what you're able to do, but sensitivity readers I think are really great in terms of just making sure that you're being authentic, that you're not perpetuating negative stereotypes, but also acknowledging that you can't showcase a whole experience just through one book. And I think that's what like Casey and Sarah were saying, that you can't encompass everything, but sensitivity readers and beta readers just help shape it a little bit more, and also just make sure that it's customized to what the narrative needs, because it always has to service the narrative.
And that brings us really well to my last questions. So people in the chat, I swear I'm getting to your questions next. This is the one I wanted to save for last, because now that we've touched on so many different points that are related to this subject, I don't like subgenre definitions discussions because like inevitably nobody can agree. However, there are some differences between genres. You know, in a mystery, you have to solve a mystery. In a romance, you have to have a happily ever after. Those are plot ones. In fantasy, you have to have speculative world building of some kind. In cozy, I am with Sarah on this, that I believe the defining point of cozy is vibe more than anything else. That it is the feeling of being cozy that you're evoking that makes it cozy fantasy, as opposed to high fantasy or contemporary small town. That there can be a lot of overlap, but it's really that evoking that feeling that makes cozy fantasy cozy. So I want to ask you all, what do you think are the most important aspects to consider when you're trying to build that vibe? If you go to start writing a cozy fantasy, what do you need to make sure you have at the core from the beginning as you go in? I'm going to start with Sarah on this one.
I literally started this book by writing at the top of a sheet going, things that make me happy. And I just listed out a whole lot of things that made me happy. And every single scene that I wrote, every chapter, I would ask myself, what else gives me delight that I could put into this book? And I just filled it with as much joy as I could, because I really wanted it to be joyful. I wanted it to be an escape. And I think a lot of people look down on escape. The word guilty pleasures gets tossed around as if that's a bad thing. And I think it not only is it not a bad thing, I think it's an essential thing. I think we need to escape. We need to step back, take that deep breath, and then we can come back and face the rest of our lives a little bit stronger, a little more centered, a little bit more hugged. So I think that is precisely what cozy fantasy is designed to do, to offer that sanctuary. And I think the way it does it is through vibes and like jam and tea and stuff.
Yes. Yes. All right. Let's take this to RK next.
Yeah. Again, I'm looking at my notes on this because.
Yeah, we have covered a bunch of relevant points. So if you want to like reiterate something and kind of dig into something we talked about earlier, by all means. But that's why this question is last. So we've done the foreshadowing. We did the build up.
I think, when building a cozy vibe, I even have in my notes, I keep going back to balance, where if you want high stakes, it needs to be interspersed with quieter moments where the character can step back and process and get support. It needs to also have safe locations, supportive relationships that allow a reader to relax and the character to relax. So I think in that case, if you want higher stakes, the ratio is going to be really important. And then if you want lower stakes, that's totally fine. I think that also needs to come with either some emotional heft and or humor to help keep the story moving. Because you don't want it to just be like everything's fine and there's no conflict, because then you just can't fill a book that way. And I think whether it's high or low stakes, it still needs to have quiet moments, safe, comforting locations, and supportive relationships. And then the rest is all just kind of like gravy and what brings you joy, just like Sarah said.
Yeah, I think that's really important, because I also sometimes will see that people say that all cozy fantasy has to be low stakes, and I just don't think that's true either.
Yeah.
But I do think, for me, like grimdark is another subgenre that is all about vibe. but nobody ever confuses grimdark and cozy, right? They confuse them with a lot of other things, but not with each other, because I
Think
think
for yourself. I'm over here in Bloodborne, and I'm cozy as heck.
You love it, and it's not this. You wouldn't say that like, oh yes, this is like a cozy world, right? And I think one of the reasons is because one of the fundamental differences, in my opinion, and everybody has their own genre opinions, not gospel here, but is that in grimdark, it's not just about gore. It's that one of the kind of fundamental differences is in that grimdark, like no matter your choices, you can't like change your world, and in cozy you can. In cozy, kind of endemic in that is the idea that you can make choices that will change your lives and your communities for the better. Even as an everyday person, you don't have to be a chosen one hero. You don't have to go to war. You don't have to be a badass sorceress. Even everyday people can come together and make a difference in the world. And it is the narrative supports that it is possible to do that, and then the characters do. And I think that's just really critical in cozy fantasy. And I mean, like, you don't need a checklist of like, do I have a cozy cottage? Do I have, like, is there a snowstorm and they get caught and there's a fireplace? Does everyone have a cat? Like, these are all great things to have in cozy fantasy, and I hope for more of them. Like, I love what Sarah said about just putting in all the things that give you joy. Like, you've got the unicorns, and you've got just like, there's just so much fun stuff. But there's not like a vibe checklist, but the fundamental starting point for me that any individual person can make a difference through their compassion is like the core thing that I operate from when I'm doing cozy fantasy. And it just kind of spirals into everything else with found family and compassion. And that's why you can have the darkness and the high stakes, because it's all starting from that place, and the rest is kind of building on top of that. So let me take this to Stephen next.
I think you made a lot of good points already. I would add to it that kind of similar to romance, cozy fantasy is going to give you a happy ending. I feel like that's a requirement of the genre.
Yes.
And I mean, aside from that, it really is just about the kind of the feeling that you're evoking. Like I think a lot of people consider grimdark as the opposite of cozy fantasy, but I think it's more horror is the opposite of cozy fantasy, because horror is all about evoking that feeling of fear and
as opposed to safety.
and so like those are the two kind of opposite ends of the spectrum for me, where I feel like grimdark is usually more about the setting, where cozy fantasy, the setting, a lot of them have a similar style of setting, but I don't think that's necessarily a requirement, because you could do it in a modern cozy fantasy or like an urban cozy fantasy.
Yeah, that's a great point. All right, and last but not least, Bree.
Yeah, I mean, just what everyone else has been saying. I think just like the two simple things is that it instills hope and there's space for comfort. Like you're gonna get those two no matter what. And I think also just like framing, because like you can have the same setting that we typically see in most cozy fantasy stories, but it could be a horror because something is off, something's wrong. Like I keep saying, one of the things about like FromSoft games is a lot of people talk about how the games instill hope in them because you're able to overcome some great evil. A lot of people have said like Dark Souls saved my life because people who really were at low points in their lives, it gave them the confidence to like overcome obstacles. That is something very much that I want to instill in my work, where like people feel comforted that they will be able to overcome the obstacles that are in their lives as the characters in their stories, even though the obstacles may be small or big, like as long as they are given that hope that they can actually like overcome it and having people along the way who comfort them and bolster them really, really helps.
Yeah, so I think that's hope and comfort. So I'm going to take it to questions now because we have a few minutes for that. So the first one I want to ask, actually just kind of, this is just like a business one, but somebody has asked if all of our books are standalone or in series. My books are, the Tea Princess Chronicles are in a series, but there is like a short story collection that you can read without any prior series knowledge. So that'll just give you like a taste of what the books are like, and when there are going to be stories that are spoilers, those are clearly marked. So if you want to start with that one instead, that one's called Tales from a Magical Tea Shop. Otherwise, the first book in the series is A Coup of Tea. And RK?
Yeah, mine are all connected. So you've got Rival Most Vile and then A Captured Cauldron that just came out. And then my other series is the Lute Song series. That's The Stray Spirit, The Spirit Well. And for both of those are trilogies. And so I'm planning on releasing both of those books next year. And they're all
Bree?
connected.
Do Garlic need to be read sequentially?
Yeah, it's a duology. This is just gonna be the 2 books. But yeah, Garlic's first, Witches second, and then I think most of my books from here on out, like this one is a standalone. The one that I'm working on right now is gonna be a standalone. So yeah, there's only the 2 Garlic books that you have to worry about reading in order. But people read them out of order, and they say that obviously it enhances the experience if you read them in order, but a lot of people have read them out of order, so it's fine.
And Stephen, yours are standalone in the Tales of Adria world?
Yes, they're a series of standalones, but they're kind of interconnected by the setting and the characters, kind of like the Discworld novels, where you may see one character show up in another book, but they don't have to be read in any particular order.
Great. And the Spell Shop standalone series?
Spell Shop is a standalone, but I do have a new cozy fantasy coming out next July called The Enchanted Greenhouse that is set in the same world. So it's different characters, different island. There are some Easter eggs for people that have read Spell Shop, but it can be read on its own.
Great. Okay, this is an interesting question that just came in, so I'm going to jump to that one. Some subgenres and cozy are still being explored. So what genre would you like to see expand into like more cozy fantasy elements? Like, I think what I'm thinking of here is like lots of like Becky Chambers is kind of taking sci-fi and like doing a like more cozy thing with it. Are there any other things that you would love to see expand with the cozy fantasy genre, or other genres that you would love to see like cozy offshoots of?
I would like to see more like cozy horror, like in the style of like Tim Burton or like Coraline type things, of kind of blending those darker elements in like a fun way.
I feel like you could do something interesting in a kind of like a grimdark setting that's still kind of like a like light and fun band of mercenaries like being BFFs together.
Yeah.
I may have a pitch that I've been working on where it's just an excuse for me to draw a lot of monsters. That is like at its core like a very simple, cozy little adventure, but the world is terrifying. And that plays into things that the main character is going into. But yeah, cozy horror is definitely something that I plan to pursue more with my work. Like right now, I'm working on an adaptation of Dracula. This one's very much more, it's not, there are cozy moments, but Dracula it's a tragedy. Like I cried so many times writing the script because when you approach it from Mina's point of view, it is a very, very sad story. But yeah, I plan to dabble more in cozy horror because just blending my passions for like monsters and things and just like cozy, comforting relationships between characters.
I think one I'd consider cozy horror is T. Kingfisher's Wizard's Guide to Defensive Baking.
Yeah.
I love cozy horror. It's so good. If you haven't read it, it's awesome. There's
It's
a
funny,
sourdough
the
starter
chat
named
was talking
Bob.
about that one. The chat was
Yeah.
talking about that
Oh,
book
is
and
it?
the
Oh,
debate on
I
whether
haven't
it's cozy or not. So that's really funny that you brought it up.
Oh, I always consider it cozy horror because it
Yeah.
makes me happy, yet there are like undead things wandering around.
Yeah, I'm excited about doing more kind of cozy fantasy romance. I have a novella called The Sorcerer's Transcendent, which people tell me is both cozy fantasy and epic fantasy, and I'm like, yes, I see how you got to both of those, even though cozy fantasy and epic fantasy are not the same thing. And I just kind of love that kind of overlap blend. I think there's a lot of fun stuff that happens when you kind of combine genre elements. So there is also a question on if you were starting in cozy fantasy now or starting a new cozy fantasy project, what would be your advice to a new reader who is like just embarking on, or a new writer rather, who is just embarking on cozy fantasy? If you could give them like one piece of starting advice, what would it be?
Be self-indulgent.
Yeah.
Like, write for yourself. Like, that's just like the blanket, like, writing advice. Like, don't try to appease a crowd that may not care about what you're creating. Like, create for yourself. It'll help with motivation. It'll help you actually make the story and like fall in love with the characters. Because if you're just trying to like tick off like checkpoints, like, you're gonna be miserable. Especially if you end up doing like a story, like a whole series, and you're gonna be stuck with these characters and these plot points and things that you may not like down the road. Be self-indulgent. Don't feel super constrained by genre expectations. Sometimes subverting genres can add like an element of fun to your story. Like we were just saying, like cozy horror, those shouldn't go together, but like it can.
Yeah, I sometimes see lots of newer writers really kind of trying to figure out the rules for like, am I allowed to do this in cozy fantasy? Does this make it some, is this possible? Is this allowed? Am I supposed to do it this way? Can I do it this way? And like, yes, like write the story you want to write first. Don't like, my advice would be like, don't worry about like trying to, like what Bree was saying, like don't try and like tick off boxes, don't try and like meet somebody else's expectations. Like yes, there are reader expectations for genres, but like if you focus on that, I think it will interfere with the creation of the story that you want to tell, because what's most important is your unique voice and your unique perspective. And what comes out, you're going to be able, if you're writing something that you love and that you're passionate about and that you have filled with joy, as Bree and Sarah have both talked about, that it's going to go so much better for you.
And people can feel it too when they read the work. They can tell when like an author or artist has like poured a lot of love into a work. Like it shows.
Yeah. Anyone else have thoughts on that one?
It's 100% what you said. Figure out what you love and chase after that.
Yeah, I agree with that. When I first started writing cozy fantasy, it was entirely as a passion project. I'd been writing lit RPG for 5 years at that point, and then I read Legends and Lattes, and it just kind of changed my life. So I wrote mine. I didn't know what to expect, and I think like the passion that I put into it is the readers were able to get that.
Yeah, I mean, I started writing Tea Princess Chronicles before cozy fantasy was a term that anyone was using. So like Legends and Lattes came out and I happened to have them, being like, I have a cozy fantasy series ready to go. So
yeah, Garlic was before cozy fantasy became established. Like it was like right before, I think.
Yeah, and like genres and expectations and the market are all going to shift underneath you. Like even if you time it correctly to hit the market, like in 5 years, the market's going to be doing something else and you're still going to want people to buy your book. So like, don't worry too much about chasing whatever people on Instagram or Book Talk are saying right now that they want from that genre, because like it's going to change.
Yeah, because like publishing takes years.
Of readers, like most readers are not actually on social media. Those are just the loud ones that we hear about. So this is an interesting question, which is how important or not is currency in your world or in cozy in general? Do you have to deal with money and numbers? And in my opinion, no, not in
No.
specifics. I think I was very clear in like not, I think I was just like, we're buying noodles, and so they tell me the price, and then I counted out the correct number of coins, and like never, like, oh, the rent is going up, but on this shop, and so we're going to have this problem, but like I never tell you what the marks are. Like I don't even remember if I named the currency.
I was about to say, like, oh yeah, I don't worry about currency, but literally this book is about like a family who's struggling with money. So that is an aspect of
is relevant. Like costs, and like, be like, okay, this person can't afford to buy a cup of tea. Yes, I have that, but I never tell you how much the cup of tea costs. Right? So at least in my opinion is like you don't need to dwell on that if you don't want to. But again, like, if you're writing like a banker, like you probably need to deal with some money values, but like it depends. You can absolutely set it up so that you don't have to.
Uh-oh, we lost somebody.
Sarah has vanished.
Oh no.
Hopefully she will be back. Hang on. Think. If you are if you are dealing with a marginalized identity that you don't have experience in, how do you approach finding sensitivity readers or making sure that you are doing a respectful and like full-rounded job of representation?
Yeah, in terms of finding sensitivity readers, there are a couple places that I found them. One is I'm on Tumblr, so sometimes I just ask people on Tumblr if they fit this identity and are willing to read. There's also some sensitivity reader specific blogs on Tumblr that will talk about topics and will offer their services. And then sometimes it's just other people in my writing group who fit that identity and are willing to read. And then there's also other sites where there's both free and paid resources. So it just takes some Google searching, and they're usually very detailed in like, this person has experience with X, Y, and Z and can read for this. Of course, because it's some of it's paid, it's not always the most accessible, which is a bummer. But I think it's, based on what you can afford, I think it's worth it.
Yeah, and I mean, it is work, and you're often asking people to read things that are going to be triggering for them. So if you need to compensate people for work, they'll decide what kind of compensation they will accept. But I think it's important to go in with the standpoint of you will be getting expertise from this person, and they deserve to be compensated for it. I've actually also heard of people finding good sensitivity readers on like places like Fiverr, that people will like list that as like a freelance service that they offer.
Dina, yes, I can, as long as I can find that Reddit chat, I will put in some blog links. I will do my best.
Right. And that's all the questions that have been passed to me that I'm seeing here. Let me switch to the other chat and see if there are any that I've missed.
I'm very excited about the people talking about cozy paranormal and cozy urban fantasy in the chat, because that's one that I've got for later down the road.
Hey, okay. Sorry, I kept like clicking to the chat and it kept like opening a different chat. Sorry, I have a couple of specific person questions, but I'd really like to do ones that are for the whole group right now.
Yay!
Yay!
Sorry,
returns!
my internet just inexplicably died. Sorry.
Yeah.
Hotel!
At least it lasted like almost the end.
Okay, does anyone have any like writing exercises for cozy fantasy that you think can help somebody like get practice? I'm going to toss out one actually that I learned from Nancy Kress, which is, it's kind of an exercise in both atmosphere and setting and tone. So you're kind of doing a whole lot of things, which is like you pick a point in a room, like it's, you know, the ceiling of the room you're in, you know, pick something, the lamp. Describe that as if you hate the lamp, or describe that as if you're a noir character. And then you switch it and describe it as if you love the lamp. You know, describe it as if you're in a cozy book, and take notice of the different ways that you're evoking the same object and how you're using the actual narrative and point of view in order to evoke the different feelings that are polar opposite from the same setting. Because I think you can do a lot with cozy fantasy, and also just in POV in general, and where your character is at a particular moment, where you're moving from a dark place to a light place, and how you can actually use a bunch of different elements of setting and perspective and atmosphere and tone and the actual word choice to materially shift into cozy vibes. Does anyone else have one that they want to throw out, just since we are a workshop?
I think when I was working on Rival, I kind of started out just doing little character vignettes just to sort out the characters and how they interact with each other, which I think would be particularly helpful in cozy fantasy because it's so character driven and character focused. And so, yeah, I guess anything that helps nail down like character voice, character backstory, character interactions would probably help inform the actual book.
Right. There's a question in here on, have you written anything else before cozy fantasy? And I think actually all of us have written books before cozy fantasy that were not cozy fantasy. I don't want to go into that now, but if you go to our websites, I'm sure any of us who have different things published will be able to, you'll be able to see I know there's lit RPG, there's epic fantasy, there's YA, there's all kinds of things in all of our backlists. So yes, the answer is yes, we have written other things both before and after cozy fantasy. Do you have time to read other authors' books as an author?
Yeah.
Yeah. I actually think it's critical to keep reading.
You have
because
to.
It also helps kind of refill your creative well. You know, how much everyone reads is very individual, but like, you know, part of the reason I get into this is because I love reading and I love stories. And I think it's very important as a writer to keep reading.
I do find at different stages of the writing process that I'm a better reader than others, because some stages I'm able to sink into the story and just be in the story, and others I'm like, well, I would have done that differently.
Yeah, you can't see it.
But turn the writing brain off, but I'm also very much a mood reader, so sometimes I'll be like, this isn't bad, but like I can't read it right now. I'm gonna go read something else.
Yeah, you can't see it, but like I have a literal bookshelf right here that is all graphic novels, because like I'm constantly reading other people's work just to see how people use pacing and color and shape and all the things that like someone who is making a more visual story has to like worry about, rather than just like prose. And then like one of the compliments I constantly get on my work is that it's very easy to read. Like a lot of kids who struggle with dyslexia have been able to read my books more, and I'm constantly seeing how people letter things and taking into account my own dyslexia to make sure that like my lettering is better and more clear and not as like overwhelming for like someone who does have a reading disability.
Yeah, those are great points. Because yeah, and I also learned so much from reading other authors that sometimes something will just kind of click that I'm like, oh, that's how you do that. Or be like, it's really interesting how they made this particular really difficult thing work. Or sometimes, you know, it's like, I don't think that landed. Let me think about why and how I would do it differently. And so I think reading and thinking about it critically is also one of the most important things you can do for like ongoing author education, because we're always learning and we're always growing and we're always working on our craft. You know, you never stop that.
You never want to be in a vacuum, because you're gonna get septic. Like you need to be constantly taking in like new stuff.
Plus, I just love stories. It's
Yeah.
Exactly.
And then you have people who you can scream at with about like your stories together.
Absolutely.
Yes. And if they haven't read them yet, then you know, be like, hey, you've got to read this. You got to read this, and that that's how we also.
That or if you don't have the time, let me scream it at you. I was like, I know this isn't your cup of tea, but if you mind if I vomit on you for like a little bit about this thing I read. Oh.
Okay. I think. What are some cozy jobs that aren't running a show? Oh, I don't think we have time for that one. That's it. Is an interesting question though.
I think any job, except for maybe like certain jobs.
Yeah, I mean, as I said earlier, I think one of the advantages of the shop is that it allows you to like be in a new place and interact with the community, and you're like forced to meet people. That's one of the reasons why I think shops are so common. And also because the choice of what you're choosing to offer as an offering, you get so much character and thematic weight from. But like, you don't have to sell things to be cozy. There are other jobs.
I think you can make a really cozy janitor story, or like your trash collector, just like dirty jobs cozy.
I think like a postman story would be great because you're still interacting with a lot of people, and people generally like getting mail, and that could just be really cute because then you're in like this like community. I don't know, that would be cute.
I mean, there's a whole following for that one guy who like cleans and takes care of cows' hooves on TikTok. Who has a huge following. Like you can have someone who like takes care of like mythical animals and stuff. So
yeah, I think what Phoenix Keeper just came out. That's like mythical creatures, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, I think we need to wrap up here. So if anybody has closing thoughts or just kind of wants to remind everyone like actually, let me do this a different way. What's next for you? We talked about what cozy fantasy we have out already. What's coming next for you? Sarah, you mentioned you have another standalone coming.
Next in July, The Enchanted Greenhouse. The cover art is by Lulu Chen, who did the cover art for Spell Shop. So it's really pretty, and it's going to have these like mint green sprayed edges, and it's about a librarian who created a sentient spider plant and was turned into a statue as punishment, and this is what happens to her after that.
Oh, so glad to see the other side of that story. That's exciting. All right, RK.
Yeah, so I am hoping to wrap both of my trilogies next year. So that is Rival and Cauldron, and then the third one that'll come out next year. And then the Luxon one I'm also wrapping. And then I've got 2 other books in mind for after that, but I'll probably be taking just a wee bit of a writing break after finishing both trilogies.
And Bree, I think you mentioned that your next one was coming out.
Yeah, so this comes out at the end of the month on the 29th. It's middle grade, but it says 12 and up, so like literally anyone. It's a good conversation starter for harder, more difficult topics regarding war and grief. And then I am currently working on an adaptation of Dracula. That'll be YA. It's more upper YA though. That is told from Mina's perspective, where she is collecting everything that ends up becoming like that canon book. So yeah, that one's fun.
All right, and Steven.
I am currently working on book 3 of my Tales of Adria series. It's called The Halfling's Harvest. It's about a halfling who owns an inn and vineyard and the annual harvest festival in this little halfling town.
Amazing. Yes. Harvest Festival is like peak cozy also.
Oh yeah.
So for me, I will probably do a special edition Kickstarter next year for my cozy fantasy. But right now what I'm working on is I'm rapid releasing a modern day fantasy romance trilogy. So then book 2 comes out next week. That's coming right up. And book 3 will be out in November. We're going to have like a brief break for the US election. And then it'll come out before the holidays. So that'll all be out before the end of the year. And then I also have a like romantic epic fantasy series called Sundered Realms, and book 1 is out and book 2 will be out next year. That's what is coming for me. So thank you everyone so much for coming here and for all your questions, and thank you panelists. These were such great answers. I'm so excited that we got to do this. You were all amazing. And thank you to Misty and everyone with Lazy Dragon Books for organizing this. And you know, our cozy fantasy. This has been So great. So thank you all for coming. We hope you enjoyed, and enjoy the rest of Hearthcon.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
See ya.
Bye.